So this is the last of 4 lectures on time preferences, and I'm going to begin by just finishing up one. Whoops! I'm going to begin by finishing up one bullet point, the last sort of slide of the last lecture, saying a few general things about different concepts of rationality and how they play out in the beta-delta model of time-inconsistent discounting. And then we're going to talk about one other topic in time preference, or intertemporal preferences, which is anticipatory utility. And you'll see that some similar kinds of results come out of a completely different modification, psychological enhancement to the standard model as we got with the beta-delta, as well as some new intuitions that didn't come out of the beta-delta model. Now, briefly, what I want to say about this, there are 3 assigned readings for this section of the course, right? There's that Frederick, Lowenstein, and Reed, which is that big, massive, long review of time preference and time discounting. And then there's the O'Donoghue and Rabin paper called Doing It Now or Later, which is basically all about beta-delta and beta-hat in particular, and going to movies or not going to movies. And then there's the one called Tying Odysseus to the Mast, which is about which is a field experiment in the Philippines that I mentioned last time. Listed in descending order of their importance vis-a-vis the midterm, by the way. So the one I want you to focus on most is the Frederick et al. Survey paper. And one of the things you'll notice if you go back and take a look at that is that they sort of present a variety of different features of the standard exponential discounting model. And then they go through, kind of like I do in this class, not surprisingly, because this is one of my favorite papers, and I think it's a very good way of presenting behavioral economics. They present a standard model, they point out various features of the standard model, and then they go through and they look at evidence and see, do these features of the standard model actually hold up to scrutiny when we look at the kinds of predictions that the model would make? And the answer is no in a variety of different ways, and then they look at alternative models that might explain these things. So we've done that with what is, I think, rightly the predominant model, or sort of the predominant aspect of the standard model that's problematic, which is the discount function and the idea that people have constant discounting instead of time inconsistent discounting. And now we're going to look at another feature of the standard model, which I mentioned earlier on in this section, which is sort of the I can't remember exactly what they called it, but I think they're calling it sort of independence of utility, that the utility you get in the future doesn't have any effect on how you feel about things now, except to the extent that you take it into consideration for future purposes. So we're going to investigate that, what happens if I actually get utility now from thinking about what's going to happen in the future. Okay, so briefly, just to finish up talking about beta-delta and talking about this all-important concept of rationality, which sort of my main theme for this course is the way that rationality assumptions sort of hold together. They're the glue that holds together positive and normative economics. And what's standard about the standard model, what makes the standard model over and over again, I believe, is that no matter how psychologically realistic it may or may not be, it never violates these assumptions of rationality. And as a result, it winds up with these nice, clean, normative predictions. This will be good, this will be bad, even if it makes bad positive predictions. Okay, so let's just review, because now we have all 3 of these different ideas of rationality on the table. So beta-delta discounting violates rational preferences, right? That's just the assumption that you learned at the very beginning of 100A, that preferences are complete and transitive, and that people will not reverse their preferences. If they like apples better than oranges today, they shouldn't prefer oranges to apples tomorrow unless something has changed. Okay, so for example, we saw today I want to go to the gym, but tomorrow I reverse my preferences, even if nothing has changed. Today I want to save and not borrow, but tomorrow I reverse my preferences, even if nothing has changed. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward violation of rational preferences. And one thing I want to comment on about that, we've seen this before. We saw choices over gambles. Remember the Allais paradox, that if we framed a gamble one way and said, would you like gamble A versus gamble B, people would say gamble A. And if we reframed it a little bit differently by adding in a 75% chance of nothing happening at all into both gambles, that we could get people to flip their preferences. And so we sort of said that's a violation of transitivity. The other place where we saw it is with the endowment effect, where if I ask you sort of what the slope of your indifference curve is, your willingness to pay, when I haven't given you a mug versus when I have given you a mug, even if I can eliminate the income effect of having given you a mug, I can get you to reverse your preferences between mugs and money, right? And so consistently what you're seeing is that these preference reversals arise under sort of roughly 2 kinds of conditions. One is when my answer depends upon when you ask me. Right? Did you ask me when I was endowed with a mug, or did you ask me when I wasn't endowed with a mug? Right? Did you ask me right when you gave me the news about winning the lottery, or did you ask me a year later when I'd already taken it into account and adapted my reference point? Did you ask me about the gym when, like it's a month out from when I might have to actually go, or did you ask me the morning that you wanted me to get out of bed and go to the gym? So when did you ask me is a big dimension of these preference reversals. And then the other dimension that turns out to be really important over and over again is how did you ask me? Okay? Did you just give me the straight up gamble, 80% chance of 4,000 versus a certain 3,000, or did you bury it in some clever framing, right? Like adding in the 75% chance of nothing. And we'll see that over and over again. When do you ask me? How do you ask me? Is how we get these preference reversals. And the underlying fundamental idea that if you ask me, if you ask me to rank apples, bananas, and pears, I should be able to give you a fairly consistent ranking. That's not really in question. We're not really contesting the basic fundamental notion that holding all things constant, including the framing of the questions and the timing of the questions, that people have consistent rational preferences. We're not calling that in question. We're going to see that there are specific ways that things can change that aren't really changing the economic circumstances of the individual. They're just changing their preferences. So what day you ask, holding absolutely everything else constant, how you frame the question, holding absolutely everything else constant. These things shouldn't change people's preferences in the standard model, but they do. And starting next week, I'm going to show you how the standard model has dealt with some of that. How the standard model has gone and said, okay, look, if what's going on is that people's preferences change from one time to the next, let's figure out a way to fix that in the model so that it looks rational again. The other thing that's going on, the other dimension of rationality I've talked about is this dimension of rational expectations, and naivete violates rational expectations. In fact, naivete by definition is the assumption that a beta-delta discounter doesn't have rational expectations, right? That they don't foresee the way in which their preferences are going to change over time, that their beta is going to, that they're going to go from being patient over future time periods to being impatient as time passes. So by definition, we've made the naive violate rational expectations, but then we see a lot of evidence to suggest that that is actually how people behave, and that is what's going on psychologically. Naives may very well correctly predict the probabilities of future states of the world, but they mispredict their own responses to those states of the world, right? Those are the 2 dimensions of rational expectations, and one of them is badly violated in this case. And what we're going to see, I hope, more and more, is that, that's not the beginning of the next sentence. So what we've seen a little bit here is that sophistication here so that the naive, okay, so we have a violation of rational preferences because these people's preferences go from, I'd rather have positive health outcomes than the pain of going to the, I'd rather give up my comfortable morning in bed to get long-term health outcomes. Their preferences reverse, but notice their behavior only reverses if they're naive, right? So their preferences violate rationality, whether they're naive or sophisticated, but their behavior, their choices, are only time inconsistent if they're naive, okay? So the sophisticate rules out all the unfeasible possible paths of action and chooses only her favorite among the ones that she'll actually follow through on, and therefore, by definition, she will actually follow through on it. So her behavior is time inconsistent, but that doesn't take away the underlying problem that her preferences are still time inconsistent. And what that means is that even though her rational expectations, her ability to foresee her behavior correctly, save her from sort of embarrassing time inconsistent behavior, her rational expectations do not save her from making suboptimal choices that she would rather not make, right? So the glue that holds together the positive side of our models and the normative side of our models is still missing, because even though she has correct expectations, her preferences are not rational, and so we still have this problem where her choices, even when she's got all the right information and all the right predictions of her future behavior, are still suboptimal according to her own preferences. Not suboptimal to some paternalistic policymaker, but suboptimal to herself, okay? That's a big normative problem, all right? And the fact that she's able to see the future clearly doesn't solve the problem because her preferences are not rational. Whoops, that's sloppy. Because her preferences, that's even sloppier. You know what I'm saying? Okay. Now I've introduced this third dimension of rationality, which I'm calling rational self-interest. I Googled this. Sadly, this term on Google is actually, most of the top hits you get include the name Ayn Rand, or Ayn Rand, depending on how you pronounce it. And that's not, I've never read Ayn Rand. I come from a state that is currently represented by a man who has her last name as his first name, but I have no association with the woman whatsoever other than that. I grew up in Kentucky, right, and there's now a senator from Kentucky called Rand Paul, and he's named after Ayn Rand. You all knew that, right? That's my only connection with Ayn Rand. And that's not why I'm using the term rational self-interest. I'm using rational self-interest, and actually in a way that's not totally different from the way she used it, to basically say a person is rationally self-interested if, when they're presented with a choice, they make the choice that maximizes their preferences, whatever those preferences may be, rational or otherwise, based on sort of the information available to them. So if there's just hidden information, they don't know, it turned out that when you choose to live in the swamps of Louisiana, there's a possibility there'll be a hurricane that will destroy your home. Well, I just didn't know that. I'm not from here, I didn't know that. That's not a failure of rational self-interest. But if the information is available to you about the probability of a hurricane hitting the swamps of destroying the swamps of Louisiana, and you go and live there anyway, and it turns out that according to your preferences and the information you had available to you, there was another choice you could have made that would have made you better off according to your own preferences, okay? I'm calling that a violation of rational self-interest. And it's, the way I'm thinking about it is, you just failed to figure it out, right? Which is completely different than the situation with the sophisticate who figures everything out and just can't make the right choice. This is a situation where you just don't figure it out, right? You don't figure out that paying a massive insurance premium in order to get a tiny, tiny deductible was just not actually in your best interest. It's almost never. You didn't figure out mathematically that waiving the collision damage insurance coverage on a rental car, which is exorbitantly expensive short-term insurance, was just not actually in your best interest according to your own preferences. You just didn't do the math, okay? So we haven't seen a violation of that yet, but we've seen this assumption come into play now for the first time in a very powerful way, which is that we've made this assumption that the sophisticate is able to do an arbitrary number of rounds of sometimes really quite complicated backwards induction. And we're going to see this come up a lot more when we look at behavioral game theory at the end of the semester. Okay, so enough about that. Does anyone have any parting shots about the beta delta model before we move on? Okay. Yeah, yeah.
So you say when you violate rational self-interest, if you know something is bad for you, you still do it. So
it's not, no, actually, so one Chico's question is you violate rational self-interest if you know something's bad for you and you still do it. That's actually not quite right. And this will make much more sense later on. So think about the sophisticate. She knows that going to the movie now, instead of waiting till period 3 and going to the Johnny Depp movie, is bad for her. No, it's not so much that she knows it's bad for her. She knows it's not her favorite thing, right? But she does it anyway because she does satisfy rational self-interest. She's done all the complicated calculations to figure out that if she doesn't go to the movie now, she's going to miss the Johnny Depp movie anyway. So she is satisfying rational self-interest if she does all of those rounds of backwards induction. Likewise, remember, she did the problem set right away, even though she would have rather done it in period 1. And again, it's because using her rational self-interest, using her sort of Ayn Rand highly powerful computational brain, she figured out if I don't do it now, I won't do it tomorrow either, and I'll miss Johnny Depp. So in both of those cases, she is exactly rationally self-interested based on the other limitations that she faces because of her irrational preferences. But she's doing the best she can with the information she's got, given what her preferences are.
So this model is supposed to help us predict what people will do. How can you explain that people who go and smoking is bad for you, but they still go and buy cigarettes and buy cigarettes?
Right, so if this model is supposed to predict how do we explain people doing stupid things like starting to smoke when they're young and then dying of lung cancer even though they spend 30 or 40 years of their life wishing they could quit. So the simplest answer I can give you is they're not sophisticates. They're naive. And I'll tell you, when rational expectations breaks down, all hell breaks loose. Okay? When rational self-interest breaks down, things can go badly wrong too. I'm kind of okay with letting people have rational preferences. That's kind of your business, or irrational preferences. But when rational expectations break down because people fail to foresee the future for some reason, or when rational self-interest breaks down because people just don't do the math, we run into big problems. Smoking is a big problem. That's a big mistake. Matt Rabin, who's the professor of behavioral economics here, who's sort of kind of world famous in the field, one of the things that I've heard him say that I really, really like about rational self-interest, about assuming that people always do all these complicated computations correctly, he says, look, for anybody who's interested in going to graduate school, the single most important strategic choice that they make is the decision of what score to get on the GRE. Right? And it couldn't have higher stakes. Because if you get into a top school and get a really good degree, it increases your future earnings by hundreds of thousands of dollars. And strategically, everybody knows that the correct score to select on the GRE is an 800. We're talking about the math part of the GRE, which is the only part that matters if you're going into economics. So strategically, a rationally self-interested person choosing what score to get on the GRE must, unless their preferences are seriously perverse and they really dislike money or they really dislike success, the correct score to choose on the GRE is an 800. So why do we see so many people choosing scores of less than 800 on the GRE? It's because they can't do the math, right? If it was as simple as just figuring out the correct mathematical answer to a complicated problem, everybody would select an 800. So then we make these assumptions in our models that people can do much more complicated math than what's on the GRE, and then throw up our hands when our models don't predict reality. Okay. All right, so this is a new bullet point 1, a new topic of the course, anticipatory utility. So let's look at some evidence about timing of outcomes, and I'll very briefly try to convince you that this is an anomaly in the standard model. Okay. So here's George Lowenstein. We've come across him a number of times before. Fascinating and wonderful guy. Back in 1987, he elicited hypothetical willingness to pay. We've seen this over and over again now, right? How do you elicit willingness to pay? You ask somebody a series of questions. Would you give up this much money in exchange for that? Would you give up that much money in exchange? And you give people, like an incremental, what's the maximum you'd be willing to give up? That kind of thing. So he did this with various different outcomes. How much would you be willing to pay now, either to obtain a pleasant experience, right? So he's asking people, how much would you pay for this experience now? How much would you pay if I gave it to you sometime in the future? Right? So this is looking at people's intertemporal trade-offs again. How much, like, if the pleasant experience is gain $4, well, presumably, how much you would pay to gain $4 now? That'd be $4, right? And then we're looking at how much people discount that if it's out in the future. And then what if the pleasant experience is a kiss from your favorite movie star? Now, this sort of presupposes that you judge movie stars on their sex appeal. If your favorite movie star is just someone who happens to be a very talented actor but is not appealing to you, then this doesn't really work. But let's just assume that most people evaluate movie stars on the basis of how much they'd like to get a kiss from them. I don't know if George thought about that or not, but and then how much would you be willing to pay now to avoid an unpleasant experience, either now or in the future? So the unpleasant experiences are lose $4 or lose $1,000, right? So obviously how much you'd be willing to pay now to avoid losing $4, that'll be $4. And then how much does that willingness to pay to avoid losing $4? If it's how much would you pay now to avoid losing $4 10 years from now, like, oh, 10 years from now? Maybe I don't care that much. Maybe I'm not willing to pay the full $4. I'd rather have my $4 now and just deal with losing it later. And then what if it's a non-monetary outcome, a non-lethal 110-volt shock? Okay, now you know why these are hypothetical questions. Hopefully you all know the history of the Milgram experiments. Does everybody here know about Stanley Milgram? This is why we have a committee for the protection of human subjects. Stanley Milgram, back in, I believe, the 1950s, wanted to understand why it was that so many Germans were willing to go along with Hitler in implementing the Holocaust. He wanted to know, was this just something about Germans, or was it inherent in human nature that people would be willing to do horrific things just because somebody in authority told them to, right? So he took a bunch of ordinary folks and put them in a sort of cooked-up laboratory setting where he had a person in a white lab coat sitting in a little control booth with a bunch of electronic dials in front of them. And the subject was put next to that person in a little control booth, and then they were told, and I think they had headphones, and it was a loudspeaker, and they were told, there's somebody in the next room who's hooked up to electrodes, okay? And we're doing a test on how much shock people can tolerate. We're doing a test on pain tolerance. Your job is to administer the shock. And here's a dial that increases the voltage, okay? And then they'd set the dial and push the button when the person in the white lab coat told them to, and then there was what's referred to as a confederate, meaning somebody who's in on the game, an actor, sitting in the next room with a microphone, screaming, right? Not receiving an electric shock, but just increasingly kind of going from low moans to like really painful screams. And then eventually there would be silence. I think that's right. That may be apocryphal. I think that's right. And basically what Stanley Milgram discovered, which is completely orthogonal to this class, but it's something you should know, is that so before he did this, he had gone and he'd asked all of his psychologist friends and all his other academic friends, what do you think is the maximum voltage that people will be willing to administer? And ordinary folks of all stripes exceeded all expectations of the amount of electrical shock they were willing to administer to a completely unknown person who was sitting in the next room screaming, suggesting that you don't have to be German to implement something like the Holocaust. Okay, so these are hypothetical, because you can't do that since Stanley Milgram. He actually sort of ushered in a whole new regime of oversight, let's say, into human subjects research. So here's George Lowenstein doing a sort of second best kind of experiment where it's a hypothetical situation. And then for each of these different outcomes, Lowenstein asked, how much would you be willing to pay to either get this pleasant thing or avoid this unpleasant thing now, or 3 hours from now, 24 hours from now, 3 days from now, 1 year from now, 10 years from now, and I'm just doing T's. The period is 1 day. These numbers are not very important. And here's what he found. This graph shows, right, here's T on this axis, and it's not to scale, right? So this is sort of, these are not equal increments. On this axis here, we've got the proportion of the current value. So it's this. It's the willingness to pay at time T divided by the willingness to pay at time 0, okay? So at time 0, immediately, all of the answers, of course, are 1, because that's WTP of 0 divided by WTP of 0. So that's just a baseline for this index. And then what we see is, with respect to monetary outcomes, we see patterns that fit beta delta discounting quite nicely, right? So I will pay less for a delayed monetary payment. That's this one right here. Okay? So the further out in the future you put this nice payment of money, the less I'm willing to give up now to get it. Well, that's pretty straightforward discounting. And why do I say beta delta? Well, look, people are discounting quite a lot even for a 3-hour delay. That's kind of nuts. A 1-day delay, they're already discounting significantly. We know that can't be delta. That's got to be beta, right? So this looks like beta delta discounting. And the same for the lose $4 and lose $1,000. I don't want to lose money, but if you can just push it out into the future where I'm discounting it, I don't mind that much. Okay? And again, we sort of see a beta delta pattern. If you push it out 24 hours, really? You're discounting this much over 24 hours? That's got to be beta. That's not delta. So that's nice. It doesn't fit the standard model because these things slope off too quickly. But it fits the beta delta model, which is now so widely accepted, certainly within behavioral economics, that some people are beginning to call it sort of the standard behavioral model. But look what's going on with these non-monetary outcomes. Okay? For the kiss, here we are, 3 days of delay.